Lady Evangeline Ashworth stood at the grand window of Ravenshollow Castle, watching the morning mist roll across the Scottish Highlands. The year was 1745, and the winds of rebellion were stirring throughout the land. Her fingers traced the cold glass as she observed the unusual activity in the courtyard below. Soldiers bearing unfamiliar crests had arrived during the night, their horses still steaming from what appeared to be a desperate ride. As the daughter of Lord Marquis Ashworth, one of King George's most trusted advisers, Evangeline had grown accustomed to political intrigue. However, something about these particular visitors filled her with unease. Their leader, a tall man with weathered features and piercing blue eyes, dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. She noticed how even her father's seasoned guard seemed nervous in his presence. The great hall echoed with hushed conversations as servants scurried about, preparing for what was clearly an unplanned meeting of significant importance. Evangeline's governess, Mrs. Pemberton, had strictly forbidden her from venturing downstairs, but curiosity burned within her like a flame. She had always possessed an insatiable desire to understand the political machinations that shaped their world. Despite society's expectation that young ladies should concern themselves only with embroidery and marriage prospects. Through the stone corridors, she could hear her father's voice rising in what sounded like heated discussion. The words were indistinct, but the tone suggested disagreement, perhaps even conflict. This was highly unusual, as Lord Ashworth was known for his diplomatic nature and ability to maintain composure even in the most challenging circumstances. The fact that he seemed agitated told Evangeline that whatever news these riders had brought was of grave significance. As she contemplated how to learn more about the situation, a soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. Her lady's maid, Sarah, entered with trembling hands and wide eyes that spoke of fear. The young woman had clearly overheard something that had shaken her to her core. Sarah approached slowly, glancing toward the door as if ensuring they would not be overheard. The maid whispered urgently about rumors spreading through the servants' quarters like wildfire, something about Bonnie Prince Charlie's advancing army, and a potential siege of loyalist strongholds. The Scottish clans were rising, and their allegiance to the Stuart cause posed a direct threat to families like the Ashworths, who had prospered under Hanoverian rule. Sarah's voice quavered as she spoke of possible evacuation plans and the need to hide valuable family treasures. Evangeline felt her world shifting beneath her feet like sand. The comfortable life she had known, filled with books, music lessons, and gentle courtly pursuits, suddenly seemed fragile and temporary. The political tensions she had observed from a distance were now approaching their very doorstep, threatening to engulf everything she held dear. Her sheltered existence was about to collide with the harsh realities of war and rebellion. The sound of boots echoing through the corridors grew louder, accompanied by urgent voices discussing defensive strategies and supply routes. Evangeline realized that her father was likely making preparations for what could be a prolonged conflict. The castle that had always felt like an impenetrable fortress now seemed vulnerable, its thick walls offering little comfort against the uncertainty that lay ahead. As the morning progressed, more riders arrived, each bringing additional pieces of a puzzle that painted an increasingly troubling picture. The rebellion was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and families throughout Scotland were being forced to choose sides in a conflict that would determine the future of the British crown. For Evangeline, this was no longer merely a matter of political theory discussed in her father's study, but a reality that would soon demand impossible choices. By evening, the atmosphere in Ravenshollow Castle had transformed from one of uneasy anticipation to barely controlled chaos. Evangeline discovered that the mysterious leader of the morning's riders was Captain James MacLeod, a Highland officer whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. He commanded a company of government forces tasked with securing loyalist strongholds against the advancing Jacobite army, but his methods were rumored to be as ruthless as they were effective. During the formal dinner that her father could not avoid hosting, Evangeline observed Captain MacLeod from across the great hall. His presence dominated the room despite his relatively quiet demeanor. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen battle and emerged victorious. Yet there was something in his eyes that suggested deeper complexities. She noticed how he studied every person in the room as if assessing potential threats or allies. The conversation at dinner centered around strategy and logistics, with her father providing detailed knowledge of local geography and political sympathies. However, Evangeline detected undercurrents of disagreement between the two men. Captain MacLeod's approach seemed more aggressive than her father preferred, involving tactics that could potentially harm innocent civilians caught between opposing forces. Lord Ashworth advocated for diplomatic solutions wherever possible, while the captain clearly favored decisive military action. As the evening progressed, Evangeline learned through careful observation and strategic positioning near doorways that Captain MacLeod suspected there were Jacobite sympathizers operating within their own household. His intelligence suggested that information about government troop movements was being passed to enemy forces, and he believed the source was someone with access to high-level discussions. This revelation sent chills through Evangeline as she realized that their own servants, people she had known since childhood, were now under suspicion. The captain's investigation methods became apparent when he began questioning staff members individually in her father's study. Through the thick oak door, Evangeline could hear the tension in voices as loyal servants found themselves subjected to interrogation about their activities and associations. The household staff, who had always moved through the castle with comfortable familiarity, now walked on eggshells, uncertain who might be watching or listening to their conversations. Mrs. Pemberton, her governess, revealed during their evening lesson that she had her own suspicions about certain individuals. The older woman had noticed unusual patterns in servant behavior, including mysterious absences and whispered conversations that ceased whenever she approached. Her years of experience managing household affairs had given her insights into human nature that proved valuable during these troubling times. She warned Evangeline to be cautious about trusting anyone completely, as war had a way of revealing unexpected loyalties. The most shocking revelation came when Evangeline accidentally overheard a heated exchange between her father and Captain MacLeod regarding the fate of suspected traitors. The captain's justice was swift and unforgiving, while her father insisted on proper legal procedures and evidence before taking action against anyone. Their philosophical differences about how to handle internal threats created tension that threatened to undermine their cooperation in defending against external enemies. Late that night, as Evangeline lay awake listening to the sounds of increased guard patrols and strategic discussions continuing in the rooms below, she began to understand the true cost of political conflict. War was not merely about armies clashing on distant battlefields, but about neighbors turning against neighbors, servants betraying masters, and families torn apart by competing loyalties. The romantic notions of honor and glory that she had read about in books were being replaced by harsh realities of suspicion and survival. The weight of these revelations pressed down upon her as she realized that her comfortable world of predictable routines and clear moral boundaries was disappearing. Everyone around her was being forced to make choices that would define not only their own fate, but the fate of their families and communities. The approaching conflict would test loyalties, reveal true character, and demand sacrifices that none of them were fully prepared to make. 3 days after Captain MacLeod's arrival, Evangeline's world shattered completely when she witnessed something that would haunt her forever. While taking her customary morning walk through the castle gardens, she observed a clandestine meeting between Thomas, her father's most trusted steward, and a man she did not recognize. The stranger wore the rough clothing of a Highland shepherd, but his bearing suggested military training, and their conversation appeared urgent and secretive. Hidden behind the ancient oak tree where she had played as a child, Evangeline watched in growing horror as Thomas handed the stranger what appeared to be documents. Her heart pounded as she realized she was witnessing the very treachery that Captain MacLeod suspected existed within their household. Thomas, who had taught her to ride her first pony and had always brought her sweets from the village, was betraying her family's trust and potentially endangering all their lives. The moral complexity of the situation overwhelmed her as she struggled to understand Thomas's motivations. She knew he had family in the Highlands who supported the Jacobite cause, and his own grandfather had fought for the Stuart kings in previous conflicts. The political divisions that seemed clear and simple when discussed in her father's library became painfully complicated when they involved people she loved and respected. Her understanding of loyalty, duty, and righteousness began to blur as she grappled with these competing allegiances. After the mysterious stranger disappeared into the misty morning, Evangeline faced an impossible decision. Reporting Thomas's activities to Captain MacLeod would likely result in the steward's execution, but remaining silent could lead to military disasters that might cost many more lives. She thought about her father's trust in Thomas, built over decades of faithful service, and wondered how he would react to learning of this betrayal. The weight of this knowledge felt crushing, as if she carried the fate of multiple lives in her hands. Her inner turmoil was interrupted when she discovered that Captain MacLeod had been observing her own behavior with increasing suspicion. During their brief encounters in the castle corridors, she noticed how his piercing blue eyes seemed to study her reactions and expressions. Her obvious distress and changed demeanor had not escaped his attention, and she realized that her knowledge of Thomas's activities might be putting her own safety at risk. The captain's methods of extracting information were rumored to be thorough and uncompromising. The situation became even more complex when Thomas approached her later that afternoon with a private request. Speaking in hushed tones while they were alone in the library, he revealed that he was aware of her morning discovery and pleaded for her understanding. His explanation painted a picture of divided loyalties and impossible choices that resonated with her own internal conflict. He spoke of protecting innocent Highland families from brutal government reprisals and preserving Scottish traditions that were under threat. Thomas's revelation about the true nature of his activities forced Evangeline to confront the reality that political conflicts were rarely about clear distinctions between good and evil. Both sides believed they were fighting for righteous causes, and both sides were willing to use methods that caused suffering to innocent people. The comfortable moral certainties of her sheltered upbringing were crumbling as she witnessed firsthand the human cost of political divisions and the painful choices they demanded. As evening approached, the tension in the castle reached a breaking point when Captain MacLeod announced his intention to conduct a thorough search of all private quarters and personal belongings. His suspicions had evolved into certainty that treachery existed within their walls, and he was determined to uncover it regardless of the social disruption it might cause. Lord Ashworth's protests about the rights and dignity of his household members fell on deaf ears as military necessity took precedence over civilian courtesies. Evangeline realized that time was running out for Thomas and for her own opportunity to influence the outcome of this dangerous situation. Whatever decision she made would have far-reaching consequences for everyone she cared about. The approaching search would likely uncover evidence of Thomas's activities, making her knowledge either a tool for mercy or a burden of complicity. The innocent young woman who had watched the morning mist from her window just days earlier was gone, replaced by someone forced to navigate treacherous moral waters, where every choice carried the potential for tragedy. The night before Captain MacLeod's planned search, Evangeline made a decision that would define her character forever. Unable to sleep while wrestling with her conscience, she crept through the castle's secret passages that she had explored as a child, seeking one final conversation with Thomas. She found him in the stables preparing what appeared to be provisions for a hasty departure. His weathered face showed the strain of recent days, and his hands trembled slightly as he worked by candlelight. When Thomas saw her approaching, his expression revealed both relief and deep sadness. He had been hoping for an opportunity to explain his actions more fully, to help her understand the impossible position that political circumstances had forced upon him. As they spoke in whispered tones among the horses, he revealed the full extent of his network and the lives that depended on the information he provided. Highland families were being systematically destroyed by government forces, and his intelligence helped them avoid the worst atrocities. Evangeline listened with growing amazement as Thomas described a world of resistance and survival that existed parallel to her own comfortable reality. Entire communities had been displaced, ancient clan structures dismantled, and traditional ways of life threatened with extinction. His betrayal of her father's trust was motivated not by personal gain or political ambition, but by a desperate attempt to protect people who had no other voice or defense against superior military forces. The complexity of Thomas's moral position became even clearer when he showed her letters from Highland families describing the brutal tactics used by some government forces. Stories of burned villages, scattered livestock, and families separated or killed painted a picture of conflict that bore little resemblance to the noble causes discussed in political circles. These were not abstract military strategies but human tragedies involving children, elderly people, and innocent civilians caught between opposing armies. As dawn approached, Evangeline realized that Thomas was planning to disappear before Captain McLeod's search could uncover his activities. This would leave suspicion hanging over the entire household and potentially implicate innocent servants in activities they knew nothing about. Her father's reputation could be damaged by association, and the captain's investigation would likely become even more intensive and brutal as he sought to uncover the truth behind Thomas's escape. In a moment of remarkable courage and moral clarity, Evangeline proposed an alternative solution. She suggested that Thomas surrender himself to Captain McLeod but insist on a private audience where he could reveal the full scope of his network in exchange for protection of the Highland families who depended on his information. This would satisfy the captain's need for military intelligence while potentially saving innocent lives on both sides of the conflict. Thomas initially rejected this proposal, knowing that Captain McLeod's reputation for harsh justice made survival unlikely, even with cooperation. However, Evangeline's passionate argument about the greater good and the possibility of preventing further bloodshed gradually convinced him to consider the option. She pointed out that his escape would only delay the inevitable discovery of his activities and might result in collective punishment for people who had trusted him. The most difficult aspect of their conversation came when Thomas asked Evangeline to deliver messages to his Highland contacts, explaining why their intelligence source had been compromised and warning them to find alternative methods of protection. This request would make her directly complicit in activities that Captain McLeod considered treasonous, but it would also prevent innocent people from walking into potentially fatal traps while expecting assistance that would no longer come. As the first light of dawn crept through the stable windows, Evangeline found herself agreeing to carry out Thomas's final requests while he prepared to face Captain McLeod's justice. The transformation from sheltered aristocrat to active participant in dangerous political activities had happened so gradually that she hardly recognized herself. The young woman who had once concerned herself primarily with books and music was now making decisions that could affect the outcome of a major historical conflict. Their final conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and the jingle of military equipment. Captain McLeod had apparently decided to begin his search earlier than announced, catching the household off guard and potentially trapping Thomas before he could implement any plan for escape or surrender. As they heard voices growing closer to the stables, both Evangeline and Thomas realized that their time for careful planning had run out, and immediate action would be necessary to prevent a situation that could endanger everyone in the castle. Captain McLeod's early morning raid caught the castle completely unprepared, but Evangeline's quick thinking prevented what could have been a catastrophic confrontation. As soldiers surrounded the stables, she stepped forward and calmly announced that she had requested an early morning meeting with Thomas to discuss arrangements for her horse's care during the uncertain times ahead. Her aristocratic bearing and confident manner gave credibility to this explanation, though she could see suspicion lingering in the captain's sharp eyes. Thomas, following Evangeline's lead, maintained his composure and corroborated her story while subtly positioning himself to surrender voluntarily, rather than be captured. When Captain McLeod demanded to search the stables, Thomas immediately stepped forward and offered to cooperate fully with any investigation. This unexpected compliance seemed to catch the captain off guard, as he had clearly been prepared for resistance or attempted escape. The search of the stables revealed nothing incriminating, as Thomas had been careful to keep any compromising materials in more secure locations. However, Captain McLeod's experienced eye noted various details that suggested recent unusual activity. The captain announced his intention to conduct a thorough interrogation of all household members, starting with those who had access to sensitive information about military movements and defensive preparations. Evangeline's heart raced as she realized that her improvised deception had only delayed the inevitable confrontation. She watched helplessly as Captain McLeod's soldiers began systematically searching other areas of the castle, their methodical approach suggesting they had extensive experience in uncovering hidden activities. The household staff grew increasingly nervous as the search expanded, and several servants began glancing toward Thomas with expressions that revealed their awareness of his secret activities. The situation reached a critical point when one of the soldiers discovered a cache of documents hidden in the castle's wine cellar. These papers contained detailed information about government troop positions and supply routes, exactly the type of intelligence that would be invaluable to Jacobite forces. Captain MacLeod's fury was evident as he realized the extent of the security breach that had been occurring under Lord Ashworth's own roof. Lord Ashworth's shock and dismay at this discovery were genuine and heartbreaking to witness. The man who had built his reputation on loyalty and trustworthiness found himself faced with evidence that his own household had been systematically compromised. His aged features showed the strain of realizing that his judgment had been flawed and that his trust had been exploited in ways that could endanger the crown's cause. Thomas chose this moment to step forward and accept full responsibility for the treacherous activities. His confession was delivered with dignity and courage, acknowledging his actions while explaining his motivations in terms that emphasized his desire to protect innocent Highland families. He insisted that no other member of the household had knowledge of his activities, taking sole blame in an attempt to shield others from Captain MacLeod's harsh justice. Captain MacLeod's response was swift and merciless. He immediately ordered Thomas placed under arrest and announced his intention to conduct public execution as an example to others who might consider similar betrayals. The captain's military experience had taught him that mercy in such situations was often interpreted as weakness, encouraging further acts of rebellion and treachery. His duty to the crown demanded decisive action regardless of personal sympathies. Evangeline's carefully maintained composure finally cracked as she witnessed the immediate consequences of the moral choices that had seemed so complex and nuanced in private conversation. The reality of execution hit her with devastating force, and she found herself pleading with Captain MacLeod for clemency, or at least delay while additional investigation could be conducted. Her emotional outburst revealed depths of feeling that surprised even herself. The captain's reaction to Evangeline's intervention was cold and calculating. He studied her obvious distress with the same intensity he had shown when evaluating military intelligence, clearly wondering about the source of her emotional investment in Thomas's fate. His questions about her relationship with the condemned man carried implications that made her father's face flush with protective anger and growing concern about his daughter's involvement in the unfolding crisis. As the morning progressed toward what appeared to be an inevitable and tragic conclusion, Evangeline realized that her attempts to navigate the moral complexities of war had led to consequences she had never anticipated. The intellectual understanding of political conflict that she had gained through books and observation was proving inadequate. Preparation for the emotional reality of watching someone she cared about face death for choices that had seemed morally defensible in private conversation. Just as Captain MacLeod was preparing for Thomas's execution, a dramatic turn of events changed everything. A messenger arrived bearing urgent dispatches from Edinburgh, reporting that Bonnie Prince Charlie's forces had achieved a major victory at nearby Prestonpans and were advancing rapidly toward government strongholds throughout the region. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically, and Captain MacLeod found himself facing the immediate possibility of siege rather than having the luxury of time for public executions and investigations. The news of the Jacobite victory sent shockwaves through Ravenshollow Castle as everyone realized that their defensive preparations might soon be put to the ultimate test. Captain MacLeod's demeanor changed instantly from that of an investigator pursuing justice to that of a military commander facing an imminent threat. His priorities shifted to evaluating the castle's defensive capabilities and determining whether it could withstand a prolonged assault by superior enemy forces. Lord Ashworth found himself in the difficult position of advising on defensive strategies while dealing with the emotional turmoil of discovering betrayal within his own household. His knowledge of local geography and political sympathies became crucial for understanding potential approaches that enemy forces might use. But his confidence in his own judgment had been severely shaken by recent revelations. The father who had always protected Evangeline from the harsh realities of political conflict now struggled to maintain authority in a situation that demanded immediate and potentially brutal decisions. Evangeline seized upon the changed circumstances to make a desperate proposal to Captain MacLeod. She suggested that Thomas's extensive knowledge of Highland networks and Jacobite sympathies could prove invaluable for understanding enemy intentions and capabilities during the approaching siege. Rather than executing a valuable intelligence source, the captain could use Thomas's connections to gather information about Jacobite plans and troop movements. This practical argument appealed to the captain's military instincts more effectively than emotional pleas for mercy had done. Captain McLeod's consideration of this proposal revealed the pragmatic calculations that drove his decision-making process. His reputation for harsh justice was balanced by an equally strong reputation for tactical brilliance, and he recognized the potential value of turning a captured spy into an intelligence asset. However, he also understood the risks involved in trusting someone who had already demonstrated willingness to betray confidences for political causes he believed in. The negotiation that followed between Thomas and Captain McLeod was tense and complex, involving detailed discussions of what information could be provided and what guarantees could be offered. Thomas insisted on protections for the Highland families who had depended on his network, while Captain McLeod demanded immediate and verifiable intelligence about Jacobite capabilities and intentions. The lives of everyone in the castle now depended on reaching an agreement that both sides could accept and implement. As these crucial discussions continued, reports arrived indicating that advance scouts of the Jacobite army had been spotted in the surrounding hills. The time for careful deliberation was rapidly running out, and defensive preparations needed to begin immediately if the castle was to have any chance of withstanding an assault. Servants and soldiers worked frantically to secure supplies, strengthen fortifications, and prepare for what could be a lengthy siege. Evangeline found herself assigned to coordinate the care of wounded soldiers and civilians, a responsibility that thrust her into direct contact with the human cost of political conflict. Her sheltered upbringing had not prepared her for the realities of treating battle injuries or comforting dying men, but the circumstances demanded that she adapt quickly to roles she had never imagined herself filling. The theoretical discussions of war and politics that had once fascinated her were replaced by immediate practical concerns about bandages, medicine, and food supplies. The transformation of Ravenshollow Castle from peaceful aristocratic residence to military fortress happened with stunning speed, as everyone recognized that survival depended on their ability to work together despite recent betrayals and divided loyalties. The luxury of moral contemplation gave way to urgent, practical necessities as approaching enemy forces made philosophical questions about right and wrong seem less important than immediate questions about life and death. Thomas's final decision to cooperate fully with Captain McLeod's intelligence requirements came when he realized that the approaching siege would endanger everyone in the castle, regardless of their political sympathies. His Highland contacts had warned him that the advancing Jacobite forces included some commanders known for brutality toward civilian populations, making the castle's successful defense a matter of protecting innocent lives rather than merely preserving government authority. The moral complexity that had driven his earlier betrayal now motivated his cooperation with his former enemies. The siege of Ravenshollow Castle lasted 18 days and became a defining moment for everyone who survived it. Evangeline's transformation from sheltered aristocrat to capable leader was completed during those desperate weeks as she coordinated medical care, managed food distribution, and maintained morale among civilians trapped within the fortress walls. Her natural intelligence and strong character, previously channeled into academic pursuits, found practical application in the life and death challenges of siege warfare. Captain McLeod's tactical brilliance was demonstrated repeatedly as he used Thomas's intelligence to anticipate Jacobite strategies and counter their assault attempts. The unlikely alliance between the government officer and the reformed spy proved crucial for the castle's defense, showing how extreme circumstances could forge cooperation between former enemies. Their joint planning sessions became models of professional military collaboration despite the personal animosity that remained between them. Thomas's redemption came through his willingness to risk his life carrying messages through enemy lines to coordinate with government relief forces. His knowledge of Highland terrain and Jacobite personnel allowed him to navigate safely through areas where regular soldiers would have been immediately captured or killed. The same network that he had previously used to assist Jacobite causes now became instrumental in organizing the castle's ultimate relief and survival. Lord Ashworth's leadership during the siege restored his confidence and demonstrated that his diplomatic skills remained valuable even in military situations. His ability to maintain civilian morale and mediate disputes between military personnel and household staff proved essential for preventing internal conflicts that could have undermined their defense efforts. The experience taught him that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt through shared hardship and common purpose. The siege ended when government reinforcements arrived and broke the Jacobite encirclement, but the victory came at a heavy cost in lives lost and relationships forever changed. Many of the castle's servants and soldiers bore physical and emotional scars that would last for the rest of their lives. The comfortable social hierarchies and clear moral certainties that had previously defined life at Ravenshollow were replaced by new understanding of human complexity and the bonds forged through shared survival. Evangeline's relationship with her father evolved into something approaching equality as he recognized her maturity and capability demonstrated during the crisis. Their future discussions of political and moral questions would be conducted between adults who had both faced impossible choices and lived with the consequences of their decisions. The sheltered young woman who had watched morning mist from her window was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood the weight of leadership and the cost of moral conviction. Captain MacLeod's departure from Ravenshollow marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in all their lives, but his influence remained in the lessons learned about leadership, sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. His recommendation that Thomas be pardoned and allowed to remain as Lord Ashworth's steward reflected his recognition that true loyalty could emerge from the most unlikely sources when tested by extreme adversity. The aftermath of the siege saw significant changes in how the household operated, with increased attention to security, balanced by greater understanding of the human motivations that could drive even trusted servants to betrayal. The rigid social boundaries that had previously seemed natural and permanent became more flexible as shared hardship had revealed the essential humanity that connected people across class and political divisions. Years later, when historians wrote about the Jacobite rebellion and its impact on Scottish society, the siege of Ravenshollow Castle would be remembered as an example of how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when faced with circumstances that demanded courage, wisdom, and the ability to forgive past wrongs in service of common survival. The transformation of its inhabitants from naive observers to seasoned participants in history became a testament to human adaptability and resilience. Evangeline eventually married Captain MacLeod in a union that symbolized the possibility of healing and reconciliation after conflict, though that development lay several years in the future when wounds had healed and both had had time to process the lessons learned during those 18 crucial days that changed their understanding of themselves and their world forever.